there are other consequences. If you're really that angry, it's your couch. You can drag it into the woods and burn it. I suppose subject to fire laws. But then the next time you want to curl up and watch a movie, you're going to be sitting on the floor, or you're going to have to take that money you were saving to take a vacation and use it on a new couch instead. This is math, this is physics, this is natural consequences. And you can take those same principles and translate them to the criminal legal system. This is a pretend tweet. It's one that I just made up about a woman who was accused of breaking into a store and stealing things. And I think most of us have probably seen posts like this from our friends or family on Facebook or Twitter. And people get mad when people break into stores and steal things, and they want to punish them. And usually moderation is not in their mind. But whether we should punish this woman by putting her in prison for the rest of her life isn't just a question of whether we're mad, or even a question of what she deserves necessarily. And again, those are important moral questions, but the practical, real world question is, what else are we willing to give up to punish her that much? As most of you probably know, as a state, each year our budget has to be balanced. What goes out cannot exceed what goes in. And this is the Kansas state budget for fiscal year 2019. And you can see education, transportation, health, all the things that we value enough to spend money on. And as you can also see from this slide, it costs about $30,000 per person per year to keep someone in one of our Kansas prisons. So you can argue all day from an abstract moral perspective that people who break into stores and steal things should go to prison for the rest of their life, but that's irrelevant if you're not willing to take from one of these other categories to pay for it. If we're mad enough that we really want to go light that couch on fire, okay, great. But I would suggest that before we douse it in lighter fluid, we should take a moment to rationally decide if that kind of justice for our toes is really worth sitting on the floor or giving up our vacation in order to express our anger in that way. And with that framing in mind, I want to get to my first sort of subtopic today, which is the state of public defense right now in Kansas. And I want to start by giving you an overview of how our public defender system works and the resources that we are, lack of resources actually, that we are working with. An overwhelming majority of criminal cases in Kansas, about 85%, are handled by what we commonly call the public defender system. But that system, which is managed by the Board of Indigent Defense Services, or BIDS, as we say for short, involves more than just public defenders. We'll get to capital cases in a little bit, but when a non-capital case is charged and the person being charged can't pay for an attorney, the default in most places is that the state goes to a public defender. Public defenders are state employees who work directly for one of BID's 11 regional trial offices. But when a public defender can't take the case goes to what's called appointed counsel, which means a private attorney who has agreed to take BID's cases for a contracted hourly rate. And as you can see from this slide, assigned counsel costs about, appointed counsel costs about $175 more per case. So why would you ever use them, you ask? Because public defenders are stretched to their absolute limit. The national standard for appropriate caseloads is no more than 150 felonies per attorney per year. And that's actually a pretty high number because it's a little out of date. It really should be lower than that. In fiscal year 2020, all but 3 of the BID's trial offices exceeded that cap. And in Sedgwick County, in Wichita, which was the highest, they did almost double that. They did 278 cases per attorney. And further, the offices that were able to stay under that cap largely did so by refusing new cases. So, for example, in Topeka, where the average was about 150 cases, that office just closed to new cases for about 6 months of the year. So the only way they could do their work appropriately was by closing their doors. And if you assume a 40-hour work week, 52 weeks in a year, no holidays, no vacations even, that works out to about 10 hours per year per case. And just because I'm not sure if any of you are lawyers or not and have a sense of the scope of that, but just for reference, there was a Louisiana study on public defender caseloads that found that a professionally adequate lawyer should spend 22 hours working on a very low-level felony case and about 200 hours on a felony case with a sentence of life without possibility of parole. So 10 hours is just not enough. And our appellate public defenders are also pretty stretched thin. If you lose your trial, you get an appellate public defender for your appeal to either the Kansas Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court. Non-capital appeals are handled by a centralized appellate defender office in Topeka. And as you can see, the appellate folks are similarly stretched in. They're supposed to be doing 25 appeals per attorney per year. And in fiscal year 2020, they did over double that. They were doing 54.5 appeals per year. So back to our math and physics, what are the consequences of these high caseloads? The first is, as you would expect, people don't want to work in those conditions. In a recent BIDS employee survey that we did, 81% of the 200 people BIDS employees said they came to work in public defense because they really believe in the work. But 55% had considered leaving in the past year because of these caseloads. And just take a second to think about whatever your job is, and imagine if in that job you had 10 hours to do what should be 20 or 40 or more hours of work. You absolutely could not do your work properly under those conditions, and neither can our public defenders. And I'm not going to get too far into this in this presentation because it's kind of outside the scope of what I want to communicate today. But also keep in mind that public defenders are also paid substantially less than other similarly situated government attorneys. And we currently have a lack of support staff, training, other basic infrastructure. There was a very big webcam crisis earlier this year when all the court went to Zoom court. So when you put all that together, sometimes people who are incredibly dedicated either can't afford to stay or their mental health cannot afford for them to stay. Another consequence is there are consequences for the clients. A trial attorney that I know well recently confessed to me that she had a really scary near miss, and she had just hours and hours of video that she had to watch, and she knew she wasn't going to have enough time. And so she divided it into the watch pile and the not to watch pile. And kind of at the last second took something off the not to watch pile and put it in the watch pile. And if she hadn't, she would have missed a very key piece of information that ended up helping her client. So it's hurting clients. And last, there are consequences for taxpayers and also for victims of crime. When cases aren't handled appropriately, there are down the line costs, money costs, like having to do trials over, wrongful conviction claims, legal malpractice. And further, and certainly not least, retrials and wrongful conviction situations can also be incredibly re-traumatizing to victims of crime as well. I cannot imagine personally having to come back and relive a horrible experience like that to testify about it in a retrial because someone had messed up the first trial. That would be just horrible. So what about assigned counsel, which I mentioned earlier? Another consequence of high caseloads is the cases have to be farmed out. And earlier I told you that those costs are, it's $175 more a case to give the case to a non-public defender. But even with that, assigned counsel are still underpaid. Currently, assigned counsel can be paid $80 per hour, which kind of sounds like a lot, but when you consider that's overhead, that's their research, that's health insurance, employee salaries, all of the things, most attorneys can't afford to work for that little. And so a lot of people just don't sign up for the work. And particularly in rural areas of the state right now, there is a real crisis because when you're only getting paid $80 an hour and there's a cap on that, how many hours you can charge based on the type of case, where you have to drive hours and hours between, your court and the jail and your office, you just can't make it work. And another consequence is that attorneys that do take those cases are sometimes forced to either take more cases than they should or cut corners in the cases they take. When you're getting paid $80 an hour, there is a real incentive to try to get a plea rather than go to trial. Trials are not going to make you any money in that scenario. And like everybody else, attorneys have to feed their families. I'm guessing that some of you have seen this episode of I Love Lucy, but it's really fun. It's just about 2 minutes. So we're going to watch it again because I like it. It makes me laugh.
All right, girls. Now this is your last chance. If one piece of candy gets past you and into the packing room unwrapped, you're fired.
Yes, ma'am. So this is easier. Yeah, we can handle this, okay? Listen, Ethel, I think this. I think we're fighting a losing game.
Okay. So we can look at Lucy and Ethel's situation, and we understand that there are two possible solutions to the problem. Either we put more people on the assembly line, or we slow the line so that there are fewer chocolates.
All right, girls. Now,
Get this to go to my next slide. At the beginning of the presentation, I told you that our public defender system deals with 85% of the adult felony cases in the state of Kansas. So the number of cases the public defender system has to deal with, the chocolates coming down that line, it's always going to be 85% of the crimes charged. We can either increase the number of public defenders to appropriately deal with that number, or we can charge less crimes. And I'm not necessarily even advocating for one or the other. I'm just trying to make a case for the math. If we want to keep legislating and charging crimes at the current rate, we're going to need to invest some money in more public defenders, also in more prisons and things like that. If we lower those numbers, we will need less. And that's really hard for our political branches of government to do. Absolutely no legislator wants to be labeled soft on crime. And I personally do have a lot of sympathy, even as a public defender, for prosecutors when they're looking at these cases where victims have been oftentimes just irreparably harmed. We get angry when crimes happen. We have emotional reactions. We're scared. We want to be protected, and it's reasonable to want to keep your family safe. But we can't consider those questions in the moral abstract. They have real practical costs. And so I would submit that we need to consider carefully how much added safety each new law really gives us, and what other things that we are willing to give up for both that added safety and to express our anger at people who are committing crimes. And that is a lovely segue into kind of the second part of my presentation here, which is the death penalty. There are a ton of assumptions and some false information, even from people who have looked at the death penalty a lot. So I want to start by just clearing some of that up, some facts and myths here. Until very, very recently, I actually had always just sort of assumed that Kansas had always had a death penalty. That's not accurate. Kansas became a state, as most of us know if we went to Kansas schools, in 1861, and from 1972 to 1935, and again from 1972 to 1994, Kansas did not have a death penalty. So for 85 of the 160 years we've been a state, we did not have a death penalty. And even within that time, there were some pretty good time periods where Kansas did not have a death penalty. For example, even though the United States Supreme Court didn't find the death penalty unconstitutional until 1972, the last execution before that in Kansas was in 1965. And so that's, 7-8 years there. And there are a lot of little pockets like that within that 85 years. Kansas is really not historically at our roots a death penalty state. Our current death penalty statute has been on the books since 1994 for over 25 years. And while we have active cases that are over 20 years old, 10 men currently sentenced to death, we are not even close to having an execution in Kansas. And if anything, the pandemic is going to make that worse, because what we're seeing is that people are very willing to experiment with Zoom court and all the special procedures that are going on in very low level cases. No one wants to try new things in a death penalty case, because if they make a legal mistake, if they do something wrong, they could end up having to do the whole thing over again. So far, basically my practice in a lot of ways has just stopped this year. I've been trying to find other lovely things like this to do to fill my time, in fact. And the last thing is, if someone is charged with capital murder in Kansas and the state either decides not to seek the death penalty, or the jury, they take it to the trial and the jury says, we're not going to impose death, we're going to find a life sentence, the only other option is for that person to be sentenced to life without possibility of parole. In Kansas, we have a true, we call it an LWOP sentence. If you are convicted of capital murder, the only way you leave prison is in a body bag. Another thing that you should know is that our Kansas death penalty is not immune to the problems that folks cite to when they're talking about the death penalty nationally. In 2018 in Kansas, almost 48% of homicide victims were white. Of the 15 cases that we've had in Kansas total that have resulted in death sentences, 86% of those victims were white. And that is very in line with national statistics. If you look at the national numbers, in 96% of the places that have been reviewed, which includes all the major death penalty states, Texas, Florida, Ohio, there is a pattern of either race of victim or race of defendant discrimination in death sentencing, or both. Kansas also has problems similar to what you see nationally with mental illness. About half of those 10 men on our death row right now suffer from severe mental illness. And when I say severe, I don't mean, a tiny bit of anxiety or something that you might not even need medication for. I mean schizophrenia, I mean bipolar disorder, severe depression, visual and auditory hallucinations, the big ones. And lastly, our death penalty is also subject to geographic disparities. And by that, I mean that the county you live in can impact whether or not you're sentenced to death. Part of that is economic. In Osage County, for example, they had to raise property taxes to help pay for a trial in a capital case several years ago. And not every county wants to do that. Not every county can do that. But even among the wealthier and more populated counties, there are some pretty good disparities. And I apologize because this is an old statistic. It just is a study that hasn't been redone since then, so we just don't have new numbers. But in 2004, a Kansas Judicial Council report found that if you looked at all the potential capital crimes that happened in the decade before that, so from 94 to 2004, 29% of the defendants in Sedgwick County were sentenced to death, while none of the similarly situated defendants in Wyandotte County were sentenced to death. And I could offer some guesses why that is. I was barely in law school at the time that study was done. Historically, Wyandotte County has been much more willing to offer pleas than Sedgwick County has. So I suspect that that's part of it, but I don't know. Either way, our body of law on the death penalty says that whether you get death should not be about where you live. It should be about the crime you committed. And so that is a huge problem. And lastly, I just want to talk about the steps in a capital case. And I want to start by saying that except for step 7, these are actually the steps that happen in every criminal case. In a normal case, after about step 3 or 4, it's pretty pro forma. In a capital case, each step gets full review, no stone unturned kind of work. Each step is about 10 times more complicated just because of the size and the scope. So you start with your trial, which is actually 2 trials, because there's one trial to determine if the person is guilty, and then effectively another trial to decide if they should be sentenced to death. And to be ethical, on the defense side, a trial team has to be composed of at least 4 people. You have 2 attorneys, an investigator, and a mitigation specialist. So you lose your trial, the case goes to direct appeal, and that's the part that I do. And our appellate teams in Kansas each have 2 attorneys to be ethical. Except for when a case goes to the United States Supreme Court, which about half of our Kansas capital cases now have. And when that happens, we have to add more, although we've been very, very lucky so far to be able to get pro bono help with that. On the team that took Kaler to the Supreme Court last year, we had 15 attorneys, and on the defense side, at least, only 2 were being paid by the state. So that is a huge cost savings that we can't necessarily count on in the future, but we're very happy to have it. So then you lose your appeal. The case goes back to district court, and that's where you argue ineffective assistance of counsel and some prosecutorial misconduct typically. And again, you've got your 2 attorneys, an investigator, a mitigation specialist, and they all have to be new people reinvestigating the case. So you can't even use the same attorneys. And then you appeal that, and it goes so on, back and forth. I'm not going to go through every single stage here, except to say that the end stage litigation, which I've got here is stage 7, that's the stuff you typically see reported in the news right before an execution, like in the year or just a couple months before. So a lot of times, those are challenges to the drugs the state wants to use, whether a spiritual advisor will be allowed, things like that. And in Kansas, we don't have execution drugs or any kind of drug protocol right now because we're so far away from needing it that the drugs would just expire. And we'd have to come up with a new plan probably about 5 times before an execution would actually be in danger of taking place. So we don't even have a plan. We don't even know what that looks like. So we have a death penalty. It has some problematic aspects. It's a whole lot of work to try to impose. We have not been able to do so successfully yet in Kansas, and we have no immediate plans to do so in the future. But gosh darn it, we're still trying. So back to math, what does all that trying cost us? And the answer is we really have no idea. At her hearing before the Legislative Budget Committee this fall, the executive director of bids said that the defense side death penalty budget is $3.5 million per year. But the prosecution costs and the court costs are a whole lot harder to get a handle on. The prosecution costs just aren't broken out in a meaningful way. They're embedded in state and county budgets in a way that just you can't make apples to apples comparisons. So for example, we know that in Franklin County for a recent capital case, they set aside $100,000 for a trial, but you can't find that kind of line item documentation. We know that the Attorney General's office has attorneys who work on death penalty cases, but they do other stuff too. So that part of their salaries isn't separated out. So we have no idea really what the prosecution costs even are. And similarly, the court costs aren't always separated out from general budgets. Although with the courts, it's, and with all of this really, you can kind of make some comparisons when you look at the time capital cases take. We know that death penalty cases take a lot more time. A death penalty trial takes about 40 days, where a similar case, so like a complicated first degree murder or a non-death capital case takes about 17 days. And on appeal, we have reports from Kansas Supreme Court justices that death penalty cases take them about 5 times more hours than non-death cases. And if the judge is writing the opinion, that's 20 times more hours. So we can say that this is costing significantly more time. And of course, the state is paying for all that time. What about guilty pleas? Prosecutors often make the argument, and they've done so pretty successfully in front of our legislature, that the death penalty actually saves money too, because people plead guilty rather than risking death at a trial. They hold the death sentence over people to convince them to take life without possibility of parole. That's a pretty questionable argument for 2 reasons. And first is that at least the defense and district court costs for capital cases that end in a plea deal are still about $26,000 higher than if a similar case went to trial in a case where the death penalty wasn't sought. And a lot of that is because, particularly on the defense side, you still have to do all of the gearing up for trial. You have to go investigate your client's childhood, mental health, all of those records in order to get the evidence to put in front of the prosecutors to get them to offer you a plea. They don't just offer you one because you ask for it. Typically, you have to show them something, show them that your client is worthy of it. And gathering that information and doing that work is very time and cost intensive. Secondly, if you're going to talk about the cases that don't go to trial, you also have to talk about the cases that do go to trial, but then end in a life verdict. And we have had several of these in Kansas, where the prosecutor seeks death and the jury says, nope, we're not going to do it. And those end up being very, very expensive life without parole sentences, particularly when you consider that a lot of those cases the defendants were typically willing to plead guilty before, and the state decided not to accept that plea. Another problem with trying to add up the costs is that we don't know the final price yet, because no case has been litigated through to an execution in Kansas. All we can say is what the costs are so far. So a minute ago, I showed you a slide with the steps of a capital case, and I'm going to show it to you again here. And I also said that even though we have a case that was charged almost 25 years ago in 1996, we are not anywhere near an execution yet. Does anybody want to unmute yourself and take a guess what step that case is on this list? Any takers? All right. Almost 25 years, almost 20 attorneys on the defense side alone, not even talking about the prosecution, not even talking about the court. One new sentencing trial, 2 separate appeals. We're not even halfway done. And in addition, the defendant in that case is 65 years old. And it's kind of hard for me to come before you and say that I can mathematically figure out how long someone in prison will live. But our current average US life expectancy is about 79 years. And it is pretty well accepted that spending decades in prison takes years off of that. So it's, of course, completely possible that the resources that the state has poured into this case could result in an execution. The odds are not good at this point. Which brings me back to where we started. How mad are we? Are we mad enough? And do we think that the safety risks justify spending some number that we know is likely a lot bigger than $3.5 million a year for a chance, just a chance, to execute a person in prison ourselves rather than letting them die in prison naturally? Are we willing to give up the teachers, the roads, all the other government services that we could buy with that money? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. That is a personal moral judgment that we all have to make. But I would humbly suggest that, personally, each of us think about that question and take the real world consequences and what we're giving up into your calculations as we think about those issues and as the League of Women Voters is formulating their policies. And that's what I have. That actually went a little faster than I thought it would. But if anybody has questions, I would be happy to answer them. I'm going to stop my screen share. Jean? Oh, unmute yourself.
Yep. Hi, Jean. Okay, so this may be beyond your topic. Obviously, it touches upon a whole bunch of stuff. So if you believe in a punitive view of punishing the murderer, then yes, you're going to talk about death penalty, life without parole, et cetera, and those costs involved. But again, it's especially when you talked about, for example, schizophrenic folks, to me, okay, so I'm opposed to the death penalty and would rather do, what's the word? Retribution? No, that's not the word, retribution.
Restorative justice.
Restorative, thank you. So basically a human being commits a horrible crime because there's something wrong in their minds and in their life, okay? And it could be a severe mental illness and it could be a whole bunch of other stuff. So it seems to me that what we really, if we're going to talk about costs and where we put our money, it seems to me it ought to go into mental health, which of course is decimated in Kansas ever since the Menninger Foundation or the Menninger Clinic Hospital. They've been shutting all the hospitals down. So I'm trying to phrase a question here. So what has been done in Kansas to move us towards spending the money on and I'm going to just use the word murderer, on a person's severe crime, on, shall I say, fixing that human being? Do you know what I mean? With 24/7 mental health. I know social workers are in the same situation as public defenders. They have way too many caseloads. So I know that that's another parallel problem in Kansas. So I'm just trying to think, what are some of the options? What are some of the ways of rethinking how we restore the health, the physical, the mental, the social, the family, the everything health of the murderer?
There is almost nothing being done. I mean, that's the answer. And for my guys that are on death row, they get very little mental health services. They, they're currently in their cell. Recently there have been some moves to sort of help change that, and that's been good to see. But for the most part, they're in their cell 23 hours a day. And when they're out of their cell, they're in a dog run, I mean, is what it's called. um, and so there's no investment in their mental health. But even in people, I mean, this is the scary part. That is just sad. Um, but the scary part is there are people in prison who aren't getting a whole lot better, and those are people that are going to get out someday, and they're going to be back in our society. And so, yeah, and again, just talking about the math of it, and $3.5 million a year on the defense side. So, okay, call it 10 million for the whole thing. It's probably more than that even, but just ballpark it. What could we do for mental health services with that? What could we do for early childhood services with that? Yeah, so you're preaching to the choir there. Janice?
Janice, yeah. I was hoping that somebody was going to say that, Jean. I appreciate that, because I think the whole argument is the wrong argument. I think the death penalty is absurd, it's barbaric. It's something that shouldn't even be considered because there's no benefit. It takes a lot of money to kill people who, quite frankly, just if they're going to be away in prison, just do that and get rid of it. The whole issue I find offensive, but it's a whole societal issue. And I think that the mental health issue is a major one, not only for people who are already incarcerated or for people who commit crime, but to prevent that from ever happening. So we're looking at this in a situation where we have a really broken system, whereas a lot of people, many with mental illness, are committing crimes. It's taking a ton of money to either incarcerate or kill them when we need to be fixing society. And I know that's not something we can say, let's take care of it, because we don't have legislators who care a whole lot. But unfortunately, it's incredibly frustrating.
It is incredibly frustrating. And we focus on the cost argument a lot because that tends to be one that resonates with conservatives as well. Because, failed government program, here you go. And I have a story that I tell, and it's very sad. And I had a client who was found guilty and pled guilty to attacking a woman who was out running. And at his sentencing hearing, it was presented in mitigation that he had mental illness. He was struggling with a problem, and he knew that he was slipping, and he knew that he needed to get back on his medication, and he was aware enough to know that. And so he went to the mental health clinic in the town where he lived, and there was an $80 copay, and he didn't have the money. And then 2 days later, and so not to absolve him of that responsibility, but he wasn't in his right mind, and he tried to do something about it and couldn't. And gosh, cases like that are just so hard for me because really, when we're talking about investing in mental health, like $80. Oh, we couldn't find $80 for this guy. And then, the poor woman, the man is in prison still, and that poor woman has this lifetime of trauma that she has to deal with because of it. It's just, it's not helpful all around. And I wish we don't get to talk to victims very much as public defenders. A lot of times they just don't want to talk to us, and that's fine. But a lot of times I wish I could talk to victims' families and be like, this is my client's fault, sure, but it's also the fault of the folks who have not appropriately funded mental health for years and years and years.
Yeah, and to take that even the next step is an awful lot of crimes, is my understanding, at least thefts and things like that, are somehow related to drugs. And we don't have enough money or are not willing to spend the money to help people get treatment and what they need so that they're okay as far as that's concerned. So it just goes on and on.
Mm-hmm. The one of the things that I saw recently was just in reference to the fact that you don't see anybody on death row that has money, that it's for poor people. You know, if you have capital, you don't get capital punishment. You get a good lawyer that gets you a much lesser sentence. And that's just part of the system, I know. But what do you do with that? Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your question.
Well, Melissa also had a question, and it kind of relates to this because, but it's the minimum sentencing, not for death penalty, of course, but for any crime like drugs or whatnot. In Kansas, we have that minimum sentencing for certain things. And is that something that, how do you see that working? And what can we do to change that?
Well, so what you're referring to in Kansas, if you are found guilty of a felony, there's a grid and there are numbers on the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and letters are on the top. The numbers go down the side. And depending on the severity level of your crime and your criminal history, you're in a spot on that grid. And it's very hard to get out of that number if you commit that crime and that's your criminal history. But those numbers are based on nothing. There's no science behind them. There's no, there's nothing behind them. They're made up numbers. And every year, gosh, somebody told me, and I'm gonna have trouble remembering the length of years. I think it was in 15 or 20 years, the number in the top of the box has doubled. So if you're a 1A, which is very serious, 20 years ago, we thought you were deserving of half as much punishment as we do now. And the problem is it's a one-way ratchet. You go before the legislature and you say, criminals should get punished less, and oh golly, what kind of radical are you? But again, that's why I think that the cost argument is so convincing. Okay, so that number used to be 300 and now it's 600 and something, and each one of those years costs $30,000 a year to keep that person in prison. So what are we getting for our money? Is it really making us safer? Is it really making us that much safer? And those are the kinds of questions I would like to see people asking.
Well, unfortunately, until we have a really good prison system where people are getting treatment, how do you even deal with that?
Yeah, and it's getting the money to go to DOC for treatment instead of building more prisons too. That's our corrections budget is going to put more people in there, not to fix the people we have there. And that's hard. And a lot of it is we don't know how to fix people very well. And then people get scared.
There are methodologies. It's just a matter of trying them and trusting them and seeing what happens. But if you're not willing to check them out or to give psychologists and social workers a chance to go in and work with people, you're not going to find out.
Yeah, and that's very true.
And how does the privatization of the prison system play into all of this?
Good question.
Fixing people in that, sorry, I have to take a breath. If you make incarcerating people a profit enterprise, it's never going to make money doing it the right way. You can't try to fix people. You can't give them the services they would need to come out better and save money. And and that's why government steps into things, right? That's why I'm a public defender and not in private practice, because by the time someone gets to an appeal in a death penalty case, nobody has any money anymore. You've spent it all. Even if you had money, which most people don't, you're right, it's gone. So that's where government really has to step in. And I would make the argument that prisons are the same situation. You can't make money and do it right. And to the extent that people are trying, I would submit that they aren't doing it right.
I have a question which may be a little off topic, but I think it's relevant. Is there any research about the impact on the professionals that implement the death penalty? I know Kansas hasn't done it, but in the last year or so, we've had quite a few, and we're beginning to recognize the trauma that we put our military and our police force through, the lifelong impact on those folks. Has anybody looked at what happens to these folks when that's part of their professional job?
Most of the evidence that I've seen about that is really anecdotal, but it does have an impact. How could it not? And particularly, you know, we're lucky in Kansas because we haven't had to do that yet. I just thinking about those folks in Indiana this past 6 months, like just following the reporters even who were reporting on it. One reporter was there for all 13, and I cannot imagine that, and let alone, you know, the guards, and part of our system is set up to help protect our prison guards. Like in Kansas, for example, the very general plan that we have for execution is that right now most of our death row inmates are housed in El Dorado, and the idea is that they would take them to Lansing and Leavenworth to execute them there, so that their last few weeks would be spent with guards who hadn't gotten to know them over the years. And I feel like I'll get some sympathy in this group for that. But that always seems so sad to me too, because then you're taking the client who is used to those people and then putting them in, you know, a situation where they don't know anybody and for the last, you know, few weeks of their life. So that's, it's not good all around.
It's simply a bid to make horrifically inhumane action humane. You know, we're sparing these guards over here who have maybe, you know, had a relationship with this prisoner, and now these guards don't. So, yeah, it's horrific.
And what about the guards who actually are the ones who get just a little bit of time and then they know they're going to be killing that person? I mean, what kind of people do they turn into?
You know, and I don't know if that's a question so much as a statement, but yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not something that we should be asking of our guards. And that's another thing, I guess, I'll riff on that a little bit about our death penalty system, is that so many of the people that are making the decisions aren't the people that are going to have to push the button. And that makes it really easy to shift off responsibility. Because, you know, the prosecutors can say, well, it's the jury's responsibility. And the jury can say, you know, most jurors at this point are sophisticated enough to know that this is going to be reviewed on appeal. And if we did something wrong, some appellate court will catch it. And then you get to the appellate court and they're like, well, this was the jury's verdict and we have to respect jury verdicts. And, you know, it's just the worst kind of passing the buck around. And, you know, I've often said, and this would be horrific in its own way, but that really execution should be live televised mandatory watching, because I think, you know, we'd have a couple of those and that would be the end of it.
Mm-hmm. It's like the military. We have people in Washington who have no connection with war, who are throwing other people into wars because of some philosophical or reason, and then stepping back and saying, well, okay, that happened. There should be consequences for people who require other people to commit violent acts.
I have a question about, so these 10 people that we have on death row in Kansas, there's, having read Just Mercy and knowing some of those stories, there's a certain percentage of people that are on death row that shouldn't be there, right? What percentage of ours do you feel like there are those that are there that really didn't commit the crimes or like you said before, committed them in a state of mind that they had no control over what they were doing or something like that.
In Kansas, so I will say, and I have to be a little bit careful about that because I represent some of those people still. I have very much a duty of loyalty to my clients there. But in Kansas, generally speaking, we have had probably one case where there was a really, really valid actual innocence claim. And a lot of our other cases, you know, for example, in Kaler, I can say this because I've said this in court. The question was never whether the client committed the crime. The question was what his mental state was when he committed the crime. And that's far more common in Kansas. And there are a lot of, you know, it's even if you committed the crime, is it really capital murder? You know, technical legal stuff that is very important. But that, you know, isn't the kind of actual innocence thing that you're talking about. I feel like, you know, yeah, it's a lot more mental illness in Kansas. We have a mental illness problem in Kansas on our death row. I will say that.
Okay.
Have you testified before the Kansas legislature on this issue? Or would you if the question came up again? I know it was up just last year.
Last year, yeah. And I believe I've heard that there may be a bill again this year at least. I don't know if that's 100% for sure right now. But I have done written testimony. I have when they a few years ago, 2013, 2014, the legislature got it into their heads to pass a bill to speed up the appeals to make us work faster. And we had to basically say there's really no way you can do this right and do it faster. And it's I hauled over one of our capital records. Actually, I put it on a trolley and rolled it over and said, how long would it take you to read all of this? And we ended up defeating that bill. So that was good news. But I have testified. I expect to testify again. And we need people to do that. You know, we have several coalition members that are regulars, but anytime that the legislature can hear new people on that, there's sort of a cast of characters on both sides that's always there when those bills are debated. And so I like to see fresh faces there. I think it's good.
So that kind of leads into my question. What is your action plan going forward in the next year for KCADP? I have trouble getting those letters in the right order. And how can we join you?
Well, again, I believe that there will be a bill this year. And to the extent there is, then, you know, the more supporters, the better. We're also constantly encouraging people to reach out to the legislators. And you all are in Lawrence. Is that correct? Or yeah. It's hard in Lawrence. I live in Lawrence too, because they're all on our side. But to reach out to your legislators or friends and family members who maybe live in other places who could reach out to their legislators who might be on the conservative side of things and make the case. And like I said, you know, the morality argument is strong by itself. I think a lot of people have said that today. But the cost argument is often really compelling for conservatives. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of money that we are literally lighting on fire.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, thank you guys so much for having me. This was nice. It's nice to talk to friendly people. I don't get to do that very often. No, it was lovely to talk to you all.
Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, this was really good information. Yes. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I wanted to put in a plug for our next couple of months' hot topic. And thank you, Meryl, so much for your time to educating on us about this issue. Just, I think, for me especially, I will say, I knew about this, but just hearing about it again, it's just kind of like, oh, good grief. This is important to work on. So, so for next month, February 18th, we have Patrick Miller from KU, who's going to speak with us on redistricting, same time via Zoom also. And then on March 18th, Spencer Culver from Alliance for a Healthy Kansas is going to speak on Medicaid expansion in 2021, what's next? And Medicaid expansion then, of course, ties into healthcare and the availability of mental health care. So there'll be perspectives that reach into all of these topics that we're dealing with. So thanks again, everybody. And this will be posted on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel now that Tracy Matthews has up and running. So thanks again.
Thank you again, Meryl.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.